but I am going to do the what tonight. So I'm going to do the what of the Catholic land movement tonight. Sister Philomena will do principles and the why of Catholic land movement tomorrow night. So I'm going to spend my time now talking about the history of the land movement as what it was, and I'm going to move into the contemporary land movement and how it's structured now, what it's doing, and its mission, which pretty much remains consistent. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the vision. It would help me orient myself if I knew by a show of hands how many people are familiar with the work of the original land movement 100 years ago. Oh, okay, great. So we get to really talk about it then. Okay, so that's a brilliant place to start. The original land movement began over 100 years ago in England. In the after the Great War, there was a period in Europe which we're all familiar with because we suffered it in the States as well. There was a period of great poverty and displacement of rural people. The Great Depression happened, and many rural people, because of the progression of industrialism and because of the progression of modernity in the secular world, they were ushered out of the comfort of their rural settings that had lasted generations and into the highly industrial production urban centers that were rapidly growing over the past little while. It was incredibly destabilizing for the social fabric of so many different places and countries. We are still reeling from the effects of industrialism and that secular effort of modernity from 100 years ago, or a little bit over 100 years ago. As people faced that, there was many different reactions to that. One of those reactions was horrible. It was communism. As we all as Catholics understand, I hope we do understand the errors there of the destruction of private property, the destruction of the family, and the dictatorship of the proletariat became the call of the Communist Party and wreaked havoc across the world pretty much till this day. So that was one of the reactions to industrialism. We can kind of frame some of the other reactions to industrialism as liberalism, as global liberalism, a global economic order that prioritized capital and prioritized technology and the rapid expansion of these things, that we, through our technological agency and the ever-speeding up moving of capital, we're going to solve all of our temporal problems and relieve ourselves from ever having to think about our spiritual selves. On one side, we have capitalists, and on one side, we have communists at this point wreaking havoc across the world. Well, a little group of Catholics came together and said, perhaps there's something different, not a mediator between these two ways, but a pure third way, a way that actually said that strong families, that faith, that rootedness in place, that history, that virtue, that these things were important, and that these were the things that should order society. And so there was several writers, some of them I'll throw out, Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton, and a priest, a Dominican, named Father Vincent McNabb, are the three I always bring up in this talk, because they are the core intellects that began to give form to this idea of a third way, something different between what was being offered to humanity. That third way, some people might call it distributism. There's been other words for it, but essentially it was Catholic. And the land movement was a movement in England for people trying to give the principles of that third way actual practical life, to try and breathe life into those principles by doing work, by coming together in fellowship, by cultivating their families and cultivating their land. I'm not going to get too much into the motivating principles of why these things are, because I want to leave room for Sister Philomena, but the idea of the land movement in one sentence was the restoration of rural property, the restoration of Catholics on rural property productive that they own. That's the sentence. That's the mission statement, and we're going to break that down a lot in this talk, but that's the mission statement of the Catholic land movement. Again, the rural resettlement of Catholic families on productive land they own. That's the second time I got it out just right. So that was the original mission statement from a publication called The Cross and Plow that the original Catholic land movement people put out. So let's just take that without getting too far into principles that's what we're trying to do, right? So the elements of that are ownership of property, family, productivity. In order to be productive on our property, we need a couple things. We need labor, we need the means to be productive, and we need the education or the know-how. You could give a man a pile of lumber, but it won't become a house if he doesn't have a hammer and know how to build. So the land movement puts those three things together. The land movement puts the person, the hammer, and the know-how together to point it towards a third answer for social order. If I were to say the word subsidiarity, do people know what subsidiarity is? Can I get a show of hands of what subsidiarity is? Great. Oh, that's great. Right? So subsidiarity tells us that we should push action to the lowest point, the lowest, smallest authority necessary to complete the given task is the one which we should focus on. That movement should come from bottom up and not from top down. So that's a principle from Catholic social teaching about how we should be ordering our work in the temporal authorities. We should lean into subsidiarity. Well, what's the lowest unit of a nation? To quote Father Vincent McNabb, what's the most humble unit or the smallest unit of a nation? The family is the smallest unit of the nation. In order to have a nation, you must have a collection of families. Unlike its counterpart liberalism, who felt like a nation was just a set of principles and ideas that one could buy into, the distributists and the land movement people 100 years ago, through Father Vincent McNabb and through Catholic social teaching, understood that a country, the smallest unit of a country, is a family. Which is essentially a husband and a wife and a set of children productive on the land. To quote Pope Pius XII, the family is most perfect when well rooted in the home. That's not the individual is most perfect when fully in possession of their rights dictated by a secular order. No, that wasn't it. No, social order works best when we have a centralized bureaucracy which distributes everything equally to everybody. Nope. What Pope Pius XII said is that the family is most perfected when well rooted in their home, meaning that they own their property and that they have the means on that property to help themselves, to cultivate their own temporal things. I'm going to paraphrase Pope Leo XIII in his encyclical Rerum Novarum. Poverty is not eliminated by secondary wages. Poverty is eliminated by giving people the means to take care of themselves. And that good social order helps people own property, own the means of production, and have the educational networks necessary to make all of that work for them. The encyclical Rerum Novarum is kind of the base from which the Catholic land movement grew from. Again, the writings of G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, all the early English distributists built a set of principles and economic ideas that then became practically expressed in the land movement. We are quite literally a continued extension of that work set forth 100 somewhat years ago. I say this, I think this is a bit that I say at every land movement conference, but anything that is good and true will reemerge over and over again. I'm not the first person to say that. I don't know where it comes from. It's something that's like kind of a perennial piece of truth. But if something is good, no matter what persecution it suffers, it will pop up again and again and again. Our blossoming here today on the ground of the martyrs is an expression of something good that refuses to go away. The idea that if we humble ourselves and put ourselves in close possession of the earth and enact our dominion in a righteous and compassionate way, that we will order our families and from that base up, not from top down, reorder society to be more just, to be more fair, to take care of each other in fellowship, and to really express what Catholic social order actually is and should look like. So the land movement became the what to enact these principles. The land movement became a vehicle 100 years ago, a vessel, a rubric for the laity like us to follow to enact these principles that were being taught from Pope Leo XIII, Pope Pius XII, namely. So what did the land movement do? That's the next step. So the historic land movement had what they called 6 land associations. How many people here have read the book Flee to the Fields, put out by IHS Press? 2 hands. Okay. I very much want to encourage people who are interested in the land movement to go and find Flee to the Fields. The land movement has copies that we're happy to give to people who want to start chapters. That will tell you this history of what I'm talking about. So there's 6 land associations, and those land associations are basically vocational training centers. So people would show up to a farm, they would book a stay at a farm, they would learn how to butcher hogs like you did today, they would learn how to plow with an ox, they would learn how the practical skills to make domestic life in a well-rooted homestead functional. They would learn those skills. Then they would get paired in a community that through various charity and sometimes gift, sometimes different deals were made to get those people onto lands. We would think of some of these deals as internships now. We would just be like, oh, that's an internship. They called them work stays. But the land movement did that work of coordinating. Perhaps right in this very room is somebody with a productive farm that would really love to meet somebody young who is enthusiastic about farming and Catholic and wanted to stay a couple weeks with them and learn what they were doing. The land movement facilitates those relationships. That's the point and the idea behind the land movement. The land associations facilitated those relationships all those years ago. There were 6 of them. The land movement also, in its historic manifest, had a publication called The Cross and the Plow. And in The Cross and the Plow, they talked about everything from principles to practical. It was a period, I believe, a quarterly publication that put together essays from people who were dealing with the economic motivations, the theological motivations, and then also stories about the practical success story of farms, talking about when to sow crops, how to sow crops, how to harvest things. So there was also a publication side of the original land movement. What they didn't have back then is the means to communicate across like vast distances. Like how many of you here are not from New York? Can I see a show of hands? Right. This was very hard for the land movement to do 100 years ago. So we have the means to communicate with each other now and over vast distances and kind of coalesce in places like this. So the associations took young farmers, paired them with older farmers, took land opportunity and paired it with wanting, deserving Catholics who wanted to live a rural life close to the soil. And so the idea was to create a conduit from the urban into the rural, a rural resettlement through Catholic lay organization. So that was the original land movement 100 years ago. As time goes on, the land movement encounters the breakdown of Europe. because yet another response, this time to the horrors of liberalism, emerges in Italy, Germany, other places, and tears apart Europe. We all know what happens in World War II, some of us more than others, but that sweeps across Europe, and because of that, much of the land movement organization is derailed. The land movement also had a hard time connecting with the ecclesiastical hierarchy and getting real support from them. They didn't have the ability to fundraise. They didn't have the ability to communicate with each other across laity like we do today. And so for that reason, too, some of the associations began to fail. War happens, and the land movement stops. It comes right back on in the 50s. It comes right back on. A land movement in America and land movement principles in America can find home in some of the labor organizing of Dorothy Day and other Catholics who did some of that. A little different from land movement organizing principles, but still dealing with the dignity of labor, dealing with the rights, duties of the social order, and caring for people, dealing with things like property and other such things. So there was a period that I'm actually just becoming aware of where there was several American publications in the 50s that dealt with very much land movement principles. The book is escaping me right now, but I'll remember it in a moment. So in the 1950s, it was mostly just writing and some labor organizing in America. We come into the 1960s and we have the Cultural Revolution, and the Back to the Land movement happens in the secular world. Many, many communes and other things start. This, for me, is yet another example of reaction to industrialism. Again, not Catholic again, but a reaction. They saw the disintegration of the family. They saw the unrootedness, the industrial nature of the world that was kind of collapsing around them, and those back to the landers of the 60s and 70s, without the good anchor of Catholic faith, went back to the land. And what happened without that good anchor? Many of them spun off into absolute degeneracy and failure and problems because, again, they let go of the core perennial truths that our faith holds. But I still yet see that period of time as another reaction to modernity and industrialism, saying, hey, there's a more natural, better way to live. We get to the 70s and 80s, and we can see writers like E.F. Schumacher emerge, and people begin to talk about the scale of political order. He writes a beautiful book called Small is Beautiful. There's a whole string of people who begin to speak about localism again. We have a continuation of what was the Southern agrarians in this period. You see the emergence in the 70s and 80s of writers like Wendell Berry dealing with issues of rural poverty and the consequence of industrialism in the social fabric of rural places. And so you get this thread of agrarianism in response to our current modern condition and the consequences of industrialism. At the same time, we start to see the inklings at this point of people rediscovering the Catholic land movement. And the Catholic land movement takes several attempts, most largely by the SSPX. If you read Angelus's back in the 80s and 90s, the SSPX is talking almost ubiquitously in like every article about raising pigs and slaughtering cows and keeping hives. I'm flabbergasted when I read the Angelus Press magazines from like the early 90s, mid 90s. Has anyone else ever seen these magazines? No? Okay. Have any? So we begin to see that reemergence there is the first place I begin to see it of real Catholic agrarianism in the laity. Now, mind us, right? This is an important point to point out. When brothers and sisters in religious orders get together and live, and their monastery flourishes and grows, if we can look at Benedictines, we can look at Franciscans, we can look at Dominicans, if all of us who have ever visited these places, many, many times you will find rich gardens, rich orchards, full cellars, productive kitchens, right? So the brothers and sisters never really lost that relationship in their monasteries. So it's something that we've lost in our Catholic homes, and that I believe everyone here is here because they would like to restore those things. But if we look at our brothers and sisters in religious community, very often when we see highly functional and productive religious communities, you will find them trending towards a deeper relationship with agrarianism. I can think of like a dozen off my head that I could rattle off here, but I think all of us kind of know that that's the case. Right? The monk in his garden with a little spade is the image. We bring us now to the contemporary moment, and the land movement tries to get started by a couple different people in a couple different ways. I won't go through all the iterations, but people educate themselves on the history, and I've learned through my work to help bring the land movement back. Many people before me had kept that flame alive. That flame in that dog's mouth about what the land movement was and its principles and the good order it brought was a flame that was carried by many dogs across time. I am just one of the newest dogs carrying it now. But that is happens a couple different times, and we get to learn each time it happens the threats and the problems of organizing. And then about 4 years ago, after maybe 7 years of homesteading at that point, I had a return through homesteading and a closeness and humility with the earth. I had a return and reversion to the Catholic faith of my ancestors. And I thought, boy, these things, humility with the earth, a compassionate and righteous enactment of my dominion, my Catholic faith, the ordering that it's brought to my home, wow, these things all are so related. I wonder if anybody else has ever thought about these things and seen how they're so related. You know, and then I like, oh yeah, our Lord, agricultural parable after agricultural parable, fish, seeds, sheep, birds, daisies, on and on and on. You know, he goes on, plows, on and on. And I go into further scripture, and it's there almost ceaselessly do we talk in agricultural parable and lessons. And so this emergence for me of like, wow, these two things are really related, who's talking about it? And I go to the books, and I go back, and I find the land movement. I read what the land movement was doing, and I was like, oh, crap, I bet this is still going on. And I look, and there's not much. I couldn't find anybody. I found a defunct website. And then Fred Simon. Are you here, Fred, Mr. Simon? Maybe he's not here. He's probably watching my children. Mr. Simon, sitting across the kitchen table, said to me, Mike, just throw a conference. That's what Catholics do. They throw conferences. I was like, yeah, this should really exist. We should throw a conference. And so I hit the web, and I found out everybody I could, as best I could, who was doing things that were related to Catholic agrarianism, and I sent them an invite or found them in some way, made a phone call or however it was, and said, hey, let's do the Catholic land movement again. We're going to do it at the shrine. And that was the first one 3 years ago. Within like 3 weeks, there was like 300 tickets sold to attend the next Catholic land movement conference. And so after that, we had the second one last year, and from the people who attended that, some of them went back to Indiana, started a Midwest Catholic Land Movement Conference that had their first land movement conference in September. We'll have another one this coming September. There'll be a land movement conference in the Gulf states that's been years in work, but finally coming to fruition. There's chapters of the Catholic land movement spread across the world. There's chapters in Ohio, chapters in New Hampshire. Many of the chapter leaders are sitting in this room right now. Chapters in Pennsylvania. There's lots. As we began to try and do the land movement work, we found that people in other places had been carrying on and doing this stuff. It just wasn't land. They didn't call it land movement. They called it other things. But that this thread of productive households, productive Catholic households rooted in the soil and rooted in good family order and rooted in the faith was kind of alive in lots of places. But it didn't have a way to connect and work together. And so that brings us to the contemporary organizational structure of the land movement. The land movement in the contemporary has 4 missions. It's a 4-part mission. And so I would want everyone here to visit the website and familiarize yourself, if you want to be part of the land movement, with that 4-part mission. The first one is worded like the original mission. It's the rural resettlement of Catholics. So it would be hopeful that we would help facilitate a rural resettlement. The second mission statement is education. You can't just move people out to the country and plop them on a piece of land and expect them to be productive. As some of you in this room have, I know personally, have made that transition over the past year or 2, 3 maybe, or are hoping to make that transition and have learned that without a ton of skills, a ton of order in your family, a ton of faith and willingness to face adversity, you won't be successful at moving out to the country and starting a little homestead. It's incredibly difficult in some ways. So education, the land movement serves to educate people. We do that through conferences like this. Outside of the conferences, sometimes people contact me and say, hey, do you know, we got a ton of maple trees on our property. Do you know people who do maple syrup? Well, yes, sir, I do. Or I need to slaughter a pig, or I need to shoe a horse, or I need to build a timber frame barn, or whatever it is. There needs to be the facilitation of an educational network and an organization that's doing that work, educating people to be fruitful in land in basic skills. As we all know, those basic skills are slipping, right? If we want to, so often we hear in the modern world, if you want to be successful, the only path to success is a high wage in an economy that you can then use that secondary wage in order to purchase your primary things. So learn to code, go to school, be a lawyer. Instead of, no besmirchment to the lawyers in the room, but instead of saying, learn how to build your house, learn how to plow a field, learn where your water comes from, and how to get it yourself. That is actually going to make strong families and strong communities, people who have those skills and can share those skills with each other. So those skills need to be kept alive, and those skills need to be passed on. That's how we keep them alive. And so at these conferences and outside of these conferences, that's the second mission statement of the Catholic Land Movement, to educate, to build colloquial education networks where we as Catholics can educate each other in these skills. We all are probably familiar in this room that there is a giant economy around teaching very high-ticketed workshops and things about gardening and permaculture and other things that put them well out of the access of your common person. So our job as people in the land movement is to take the common skills and make them common again, to make them accessible to the common person, to in good Catholic fellowship, to share what we have with one another and teach. So we're trying to break down that, in education-wise, we're trying to break down that idea of the YouTube expert selling you a $3,000 workshop to grow garlic and just learning it from your neighbor. Right? That's what we're trying to create. And if you call the land movement can say, oh yeah, there's a guy down the road from you. He's a good Catholic. Ask him about his, time in the monastery in France. He'd love to tell you, So education is the second point. Fellowship is the third orienting mission of the land movement. If anybody has been a homesteader or tried that homesteading technique, you become quickly familiar that the most important ingredient is other people. It's not like the tools you have or having, the perfect crop or anything else. It's other people to support you in times of hardship and difficulty, other people to labor with, other people to share with, to exchange goods with. This is what makes you successful as a homesteader, other people. And so in order to have that other person part as Catholics, we need to build fellowship with one another. We need fellowship amongst each other and a network that we can plug into. So when I get out to my farm and I want to raise my timber frame, where's the Catholic network that I call to raise my timber frame? When I want to put up my hay and my boy's just gone off to college and I'm all alone now, where's the network that I call to say, hey, Catholics, help me out, I got to put up the hay for the year? When I'm sick or I break my leg and I can't milk my cow, can't get to the barn in winter, where's the network? And so those should be in our parishes, but the Catholic Land Movement's idea is to make an actual agrarian network of agrarian Catholics helping agrarian Catholics. So when that call goes out to raise that barn, it goes out to all of you and to all the other conferences that are happening everywhere, and we raise that barn for that family. So that's the fellowship part. That ties into the idea of eventual internships and other stuff like that. Rural resettlement is the goal, education, fellowship, and the fourth part of the principles is the glorification of God. So often when people get involved in like homesteading or these things, they come from two places sometimes that I've witnessed. One place is that they come in and they're like, okay, I got a tomato, and in the tomato there's 1,000 seeds. So out of that one tomato, I can get 1,000 tomato plants, and each tomato plant makes about 10 to 20 potatoes, and each one of those seeds got 1,000 seeds in it. So then I can plant another 1,000, and I'm going to be rich because I'm going to grow tomatoes. Oh boy, we're going to be rich. So that's one motivation I've seen, which the agrarians amongst us will laugh at. The second one that I see is that boy, the world is ending, the temporal authorities are a disaster, there's strife and darkness all around me. I'm so full of fear about what I'm seeing in the world. I desperately need to satisfy my material needs. Let me learn how to homestead, and if I just get on my own well, and I grow all my own food, and I sit on a pile of it, and I have enough ammunition and a tower maybe and barbed wire, I'll be okay while everything falls apart. Those are the two wrong extremes that I see people going towards homesteading with. The Catholic Land Movement, in its fourth principle, with the glorification of God, is really the base, the center, and the purpose. Changes the motivation for why we do these things. Instead of coming from a sense of greed or want or temporal desire or fear and lack and desperation, we come from that inexhaustible wellspring of love that Christ gives us, of love for Him, His love for us, our love for one another, and by centering God, we motivate our efforts from something that is eternal and unexhaustible. And then we share that with other people. So the fourth principle of the land movement is that, the glorification of God, the fourth motivating principle. So those are the four principles with which we organize now. Let's talk about the structure of the land movement now. The structure of the land movement is kind of like three parts right now. I'd hope to add a fourth part in time, maybe even a fifth part. So let's just talk a little bit about what the land movement is not first, and then I'll talk about what it is. The land movement is not an attempt for us to create an intentional community in a geographic place and have us all move there so we're safe. That is attempting to centrally plan an ordered society that we can be safe in. For Catholics, that's more like a monastery is what you're actually looking for, which is great. Religious life is wonderful. But that's more what you're looking for if that's your motivation. Again, that principle of subsidiarity says that through our good work, our trust in God, our prayer, we can build from the bottom up, right where we are, the social order to point towards the kingship of Christ. And so that's what the land movement is about. I am all for people who want to try and make an intentional community work somewhere. And I, as part of the land movement and my leadership team, I'm sure if any of you guys saw an intentional community forming and you'd be like, let me help you guys. Let's have some events for you guys. But the creation of the community is not the land movement's job. The land movement is a tertiary support system for the creation of those communities and an expression of subsidiarity by just trying to do this in our own lives right now. I often take phone calls from people who are like, Mike, I'm trapped in an apartment. What do? I can't do the land movement. I have to, Johnny Appleseed off into the woods, or I have to be like Pa Ingalls and load up the family and go out to the homestead. We work from where we are with what we have. Oh, that's my wave. Good, sir. 4 minutes I got? That's 40 minutes. I've done 40 minutes. You all are so gracious with your time. Thank you. We work with people in the land movement with what they have from where they are. Meaning that if I talk to someone in a jail cell, I'm like, are there birds at the window that you could feed? Can you grow something in a crack? Can you watch it grow? Can you pray for its good growth? Can you move the guy next to you to take care of something? And no one will ever completely have taken away from them the opportunity to enact their good dominion on the created world. So no matter where someone is, they can take steps, and we motivate those steps. We're not here to tell everyone that they need to go drive off to a homestead. It's great when they do. Love to see it. I'll help you. But that's not. So land movement is not intentional communities. The land movement is not driving everyone out of where they are to where they have to go, but it's working with people from where they are, building skill sets to make their lives and their communities more fruitful in Christ and in temporal things, to support one another and cultivate our virtue and Catholic character. So land movement chapters usually have a singular leader. Sometimes it's a collection of 2 people, but they have a leader who introduces these talks. They do some time to kind of catechize themselves in the principles of the land movement. They read the historical documents, Rerum Novarum. Oh, help me say this one. Pope Pius XII. I can never say it. I always butcher it. Thank you. Yes. I could walk you through a reading list. If you come and talk to me, oh, yeah, I want to start a chapter in my parish, I'm happy to walk you through a reading list. They begin to understand the motivating principles of it, and then I walk them through the organizational strategy, which in brief, since I'm already at my 40 minutes, and I'm only going to make you suffer me for another 10, is I move you through a cultivation of principle, an identification of some strategic goals that are attainable for you and your immediate people around you. I share with you the suite of tactics available to you from the existing network of the land movement. Hey, this is what other people have done. These are the things that I see work. These are the things that I see don't work. And then I call you back and say, hey, how did it go? Did you have your general interest meeting yet? Did you call people together? Action. So that's the organizing rubric of the if we don't have principles, we have mission drift. If we don't have attainable and clearly defined strategic goals, we have failure. If we don't have a suite of tactics that are diverse and can be applied to different situations, we're kind of crippled and ineffective. And if we don't act, then we better get tenured in a university somewhere where you can sit around and never do anything. Right? So we have to have action. We have to have tactics and means to do it. We have to have clear goals so we don't mission drift. We have to have principles that anchor us to our work, good and true. So I walk leadership over and over again. There are chapters almost in every state, in various states. I grow apple trees. Sometimes people ask me, how many apple trees are in your field? Well, do I count the one that's kind of crippled and dying? Or do I only count the ones that are 15 feet tall or 30 feet tall and bearing fruit? Because I have thousands if I count them all. Well, the same is kind of true for the land movement chapters. Some of them are very fruitful and active and organizing their own conferences and doing a whole bunch of stuff, and some just exist as like a seed of hope in like 1 or 2 people. But they're out there. So I encourage all of you to take what you learned these 4 weeks in the way, these four weeks, in these 4 workshop sessions and these 3 days, and take it back to your parish community. I'll end my talk with this, which is what I started my talk with last year. Am I alone in dreaming of a world where I wake up to the sound of bells calling me to daily office, and then leaving there for a meal with my family, and then leaving there to meet my brothers in the field where we work by the sweat of our brow, and pause to say the Angelus at 12, and then return to the field, and then go to the home where my wife is productive with my children in a domestic setting where things are being made, where the children worked on dresses and canning and pickling food, and I went out and milked the animals at the end of the day, and then I went to the monastery, which was right down the road, and caught Vespers at night. Maybe there was a Mass. I lived an agricultural life layered on top of a liturgical life, where Ember and Rogation days really meant something in my life, because the blessing of my fields was critically important, when fast days really actually helped keep my larder full, when Lent was really about making it through spring. I dream sometimes of living that simple life. Am I alone in dreaming that? Like, anybody else feel like they want that? Yeah. I think there's something deep in all of us as Catholics that calls us to that idea of a life, of a cadence of seasons, of a deepness in our prayer and liturgical life, a deepness in our relationship to our labor and its dignity, and an ordering, a natural order to our family that is beautiful and touched by God's grace. I believe that many of us as Catholics hold that dream. For 3 days at this conference, squint your eyes and just pretend that that's what we live like. You're going to go to daily office every day. You're going to get to talk with people about deeper principles. You're going to get to build fellowship, maybe even take a workshop and toil. You're going to get to share meals with people in your community for 3 days. Let yourself live that dream that I think we all carry about what Catholic community could be like. Then we're going to go out into the world and make it happen. So, that's it for me. But if you guys have questions for me, I'm happy to talk after this. There's so much more. I could go on for hours and hours and hours, but I'll spare you that. God bless you all. Thank you for making the dream of this a reality.